A judge mocked a black man, certain he was just another guilty defendant. But when the disabled man stood up and revealed his identity, the room fell silent. Who was really on trial? Ever seen the truth flip everything upside down? Share your thoughts below. This story's about to get wild. Follow the story, you won't believe what happens. The trial was the talk of New Haven, a city where justice was supposed to reign, but that morning in the packed district court, something felt off. The system, built on laws and truth, seemed to wobble on shaky ground. Among the jurors was Marcus Reed, an everyday guy, family man, insurance worker, the kind who trusted the process. He sat with 11 others, tasked with deciding the fate of a man who looked like he'd already lost. That man was Caleb Grant, a black guy in his late 30s, sitting in a wheelchair, hands steady, face giving nothing away. The charge was fraud, forged documents, stolen government cash, a scheme to game the system. Caleb didn't flinch, didn't plead, just watched the room with a calm that unsettled everyone. Most jurors had already made up their minds, their glances sharp. Judge Theodore Langston took the bench, his presence heavy as a storm cloud. He fixed Caleb with a cold stare and said, "Mr. Grant, I've seen too many like you in here, always working an angle to dodge the law." The words landed like a punch, dripping with venom. "Like you." The room knew what he meant, and a few jurors nodded, their faces tight with agreement. Langston's smirk said it all. Caleb was guilty, trial or no trial. Michael Vaughn, the prosecutor, was cut from the same cloth. In a slick suit, he spoke with the confidence of a man who'd never lost a case. "Folks," he said to the jury, "this one's open and shut." He pointed to a neat stack of documents, pristine as fresh snow. "These are fake aid forms, signed by Caleb Grant, a guy from a part of town known for milking the system." He lingered on the last part, letting it sink in. A juror, a middle-aged woman with a tight bun, leaned over and whispered, "You can tell he's trouble, just look at him." Another, a guy with a faded tie, muttered, "Always the same story with these people." Vaughn held up a financial record, waving it like a flag. "Every transaction points to Grant, no errors, no gaps, just hard evidence." His voice was smooth, smug, and he shot Caleb a glance, daring him to argue. Marcus Reed shifted in his seat, uneasy. The evidence was too perfect, like something out of a movie. Real cases were messy, full of holes, contradictions. This felt like a setup, wrapped up too neatly. The other jurors didn't seem to care. A man in a plaid shirt crossed his arms, nodding at Vaughn's every word, his scowl fixed on Caleb. "Figures," he grumbled, just loud enough to be heard. "Guys like him always think they're slick." The room buzzed with unspoken judgment, not fear, but a quiet pact that Caleb was done for. Langston's smirk widened, like he was watching a play he'd directed. Vaughn adjusted his tie and sat down, his case laid out like a winning hand, ready for the jury to fold. Marcus Reed wasn't so sure. Langston's jab, Vaughn's loaded words, the jurors' whispers, they weren't just about the evidence, they were about Caleb, his skin, his place in their world. The justice system Marcus had always believed in felt like it was bending and not toward the truth. As the trial rolled on, that knot in his gut only tightened. The New Haven courtroom hummed with unease, the air thick after Michael Vaughn's airtight presentation. Caleb Grant, the man in the wheelchair, sat calm, his steady gaze unsettling the jury. Most had already judged him, their whispers sharp with bias. But Marcus Reed, one of the 12, wasn't so sure. Something about this trial felt wrong, and as the proceedings rolled on, that feeling only grew. Vaughn had laid out his case like a pro, his stack of pristine documents painting Caleb as a fraudster who'd fleeced the government. The jury listened, some nodding, others muttering. "Just look at him," a juror in a gray sweater hissed to her neighbor. "Guys like that always have a scam." Her words carried the weight of assumption, and the man beside her grunted in agreement, his eyes fixed on Caleb with disdain. Marcus shifted in his seat, catching the exchange. The evidence was too clean, too perfect for a real case. Investigations were messy, full of gaps, but this? It felt like a setup. Vaughn stepped forward again, his voice smooth as glass. "Mr. Grant," he said, turning to Caleb, "do you deny these documents bear your signature?" The question was a trap, laced with a smirk that said he'd already won. Caleb didn't blink. "I don't deny my name's on them," he said, his tone even, "but someone made it look that way." A murmur rippled through the room. Vaughn's smirk faltered for a split second, caught off guard. The jurors exchanged glances, some scoffing. "He's reaching," a man with a buzz cut muttered, loud enough for half the room to hear. Typical excuse from his kind. Judge Theodore Langston leaned forward, his face a mask of contempt. "Let's get this straight, Grant," he drawled, his voice heavy with mockery. "You're saying these official records, your name, your signature, were fabricated? You think you can play the game better than the system?" The word "you" carried a sting, a jab at Caleb's identity. Langston's eyes narrowed, his smirk daring Caleb to push back. A few jurors chuckled, their bias plain as day. Marcus gripped the armrest, his unease spiking. Caleb's calm response wasn't defiance or desperation, it was conviction. What if he was telling the truth? The defense attorney, a wiry man named Paul Whitaker, saw his chance. He stood, adjusting his glasses. "Your Honor, this raises serious questions about the evidence. If my client's signature was forged, we need to investigate." Langston's gavel slammed down, cutting him off like a gunshot. "Enough!" the judge barked, his voice sharp. "I've heard this song and dance before, Whitaker. People like your client always claim they're framed." His sneer made it clear who people meant. The room tensed, and Whitaker hesitated, glancing at Caleb. Marcus caught the look. Caleb nodded slightly, urging him on. Whitaker tried again. "Your Honor, with respect, we can't ignore the possibility of tampering. We need—" Another gavel strike, louder this time. Langston's eyes locked on Whitaker, cold and unyielding. "This court won't waste time on conspiracy theories," he snapped. "The evidence is clear, and I won't let a fraudster like Grant spin stories to dodge justice." His words were a warning, not just to Whitaker, but to anyone daring to question his rule. The jurors sat still, some smirking, others avoiding Caleb's gaze. A woman in a blue blazer whispered, "He's just stalling. They always do." Marcus felt a chill. Langston wasn't just shutting down Whitaker, he was shutting down the truth. The judge's bias was blatant, his words dripping with the same prejudice Vaughn had leaned into. The jurors' mutters, "His kind, they always do," echoed that sentiment, their minds made up before Caleb even spoke. If Marcus glanced at Caleb, who sat unmoved, his hands steady in his lap. That calm wasn't the mark of a guilty man, it was something else, something that made Marcus question everything. Langston leaned back, exhaling as if the exchange was a minor annoyance. "Move on," he ordered, his gavel poised like a weapon. The door to fairness slammed shut, and the trial marched forward under his iron grip. Vaughn adjusted his tie, regaining his composure, ready to hammer the next nail in Caleb's coffin. The jurors settled in, their whispers fading but their judgment lingering. Marcus sat in silence, the weight of doubt pressing harder. This wasn't justice, it was a script, and Caleb was playing a role someone else had written. The courtroom felt like a pressure cooker, the air heavy with judgment. Caleb Grant, the man accused of fraud, sat unwavering in his wheelchair, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the hostility around him. Most jurors had already written him off, their whispers laced with bias. Marcus Reed, the lone juror with doubts, sat in silence, grappling with the sinking feeling that this trial was anything but fair. Judge Theodore Langston's iron grip on the room only made it worse. Langston ruled the courtroom like a dictator, his earlier dismissal of Caleb's defense still echoing. His words, "people like your client," had set the tone, and the jury followed his lead. A man in a plaid jacket leaned toward his neighbor, muttering, "Grant's just playing the victim card. They always do." His voice carried, and a woman with a tight ponytail nodded, her eyes narrowing at Caleb. "He's not fooling anyone," she whispered back. Their words weren't about evidence, they were about who Caleb was. Marcus caught every syllable, his hands clenching the armrest. The deck was stacked, and everyone seemed fine with it. Michael Vaughn, the prosecutor, sensed the room's mood and doubled down. He paced before the jury, his voice sharp. "Let's not get distracted," he said, gesturing to the pristine documents on his table. "Caleb Grant's signature is on every one of these forms. He's from a neighborhood where this kind of hustle is second nature." The jab was deliberate, painting Caleb as a stereotype. A juror in a faded tie smirked, muttering, "Exactly, born to scam." Vaughn's eyes flicked to Langston, who gave a slight nod, as if approving the tactic. Marcus shifted, the prosecutor's words gnawing at him. This wasn't a trial, it was a performance. Caleb broke the tension. In a voice steady as stone, he spoke. "I'm not guilty. Those documents were fabricated." The room froze. His words weren't loud, but they carried a weight that silenced the whispers. Langston's smirk vanished, replaced by a scowl. "That's rich, Grant," he snapped, leaning forward. "You think you're smarter than this court? People like you always have an excuse, but you're not slipping through the cracks here." His tone was venomous, the "people like you" a clear jab at Caleb's race. A few jurors chuckled, their bias plain. One, a guy with a crew cut, leaned back and said, "He's wasting our time." Marcus felt the room closing in. Caleb's calm wasn't the mark of a liar, it was the mark of someone who knew something the rest didn't. But Langston wasn't having it. He waved a hand, dismissing Caleb's claim like swatting a fly. "This court deals in facts, not fairy tales," he said, his voice cold. "The evidence is ironclad, and I won't let you derail justice with your stories." The jurors nodded along, their faces set. A woman in a blue blazer whispered, "He's done. They never learn." Marcus glanced at Caleb, who met Langston's glare without flinching. That steadiness wasn't guilt, it was defiance. Vaughn seized the moment, stepping forward with a smug grin. "Your Honor, the prosecution rests. Grant's claims don't change the facts. His name, his signature, his guilt." He turned to the jury, his voice dripping with certainty. "You've seen the evidence. You know what kind of man he is." The implication hung in the air, and the jurors ate it up. A man in a gray sweater crossed his arms, muttering, "Case closed." Marcus's stomach churned. The trial felt like a rigged game, and Caleb was the only one not playing. Langston leaned back, his gavel in hand, ready to steer the trial to its inevitable end. "We've heard enough," he said, his eyes scanning the jury with a look that demanded compliance. "The evidence speaks for itself. It's time to wrap this up." The room fell silent, the weight of his words pressing down. The jurors avoided Caleb's gaze, their minds made up. Marcus sat rigid, his doubt now a roaring fire. Langston's bias, Vaughn's jabs, the jury's whispers, they weren't chasing truth, they were chasing a verdict, one written before the trial began. As Langston prepared to deliver his ruling, the tension was palpable. Caleb sat still, his hands steady, his eyes locked on the judge. The jurors waited, their faces a mix of smugness and indifference. Marcus gripped the edge of his seat, the injustice too loud to ignore. Something was about to break, and the courtroom was on the edge of a reckoning. The courtroom crackled with tension, every eye on Judge Theodore Langston as he prepared to deliver his verdict. Caleb Grant, accused of fraud, sat steady in his wheelchair, his calm defiance a silent challenge to the room's hostility. The jury, save for Marcus Reed, had bought the prosecution's story, their whispers thick with bias. Marcus, the only juror with doubts, clenched his fists, the weight of injustice too heavy to bear. What happened next would turn the trial upside down. Langston's voice boomed, his earlier jabs at Caleb, "People like you," still hanging in the air. "Caleb Grant," he began, his tone final, "the evidence is clear. Your claims of fabricated documents are a desperate ploy, typical of your kind." The words dripped with venom, and a few jurors nodded, their faces smug. A man in a gray sweater muttered, "He's done for, about time." The woman beside him, her ponytail tight, whispered, "They never learn." Their bias wasn't hidden, it was the trial's backbone. Before Langston could finish, Marcus Reed shot to his feet, his voice cutting through the room. "Your Honor, wait! This doesn't add up. The evidence is too perfect. Real cases aren't this clean." The courtroom froze. Jurors turned, their eyes narrowing with contempt. "What's he doing?" A man in a faded tie hissed. "Trying to play hero?" The woman in a blue blazer scoffed. "He's wasting our time." Their whispers were sharp, dismissing Marcus as naive, or worse, a troublemaker siding with someone like Grant. Langston's gavel slammed down, his face twisting with fury. "Mr. Reed, sit down," he barked. "You're out of line. Interrupt again and I'll have you removed. Trust me, you'll regret it." His threat was a blade, meant to silence. Marcus stood firm, his voice shaking but resolute. "This trial isn't fair, Your Honor. We're rushing to judgment without questioning the evidence. Grant deserves a real chance." The room erupted in murmurs. A juror in a plaid jacket leaned forward, muttering, "Who does he think he is, defending that guy?" The disdain was palpable, aimed at Marcus for daring to challenge the script. Vaughn, the prosecutor, smirked, sensing an easy win. "Your Honor, Mr. Reed's outburst doesn't change the facts. Grant's guilty and the jury knows it." He glanced at the jurors, his nod reinforcing their bias. A man with a crew cut grunted, "Yeah, let's get this over with." Langston's eyes locked on Marcus, cold and unyielding. "Last warning, Reed," he said, his voice low. "Sit down, or you're out." Marcus hesitated, then sat, his face flushed but unbowed. The jury's glares burned, their whispers branding him an outsider. Langston exhaled, regaining control. "Caleb Grant," he declared, "I find you guilty?" The words landed like a hammer, final and cold. No gasps, just a heavy silence. The jurors sat back, satisfied, their bias validated. Vaughn adjusted his tie, his smirk wider. A woman in a gray blazer whispered, "Good, throw the book at him." Caleb sat still, his hands steady, his eyes on Langston. Marcus gripped his seat, the verdict hitting like a punch. This wasn't justice, it was a setup, and he'd failed to stop it. Then, a sound. A slow creak of wheels. Caleb adjusted his wheelchair, the noise faint but piercing in the silent room. Every eye turned as he gripped the armrests, his hands firm. In one smooth motion, Caleb Grant stood up. Not shaky, not struggling. He rose with a quiet strength that didn't belong in that chair. The room gasped. A pen clattered to the floor. The woman with the ponytail choked out a sound, her face pale. Vaughn's mouth dropped, his polished confidence crumbling. Langston snapped back in his chair, his hands clutching the bench, eyes wide with shock. Caleb stood tall, his gaze locked on Langston, unflinching. The jurors froze, their smugness gone. Marcus stared, his breath caught. The man they'd condemned, the man they'd written off, wasn't what he seemed. The trial had just flipped, and the real reckoning was about to begin. The courtroom was a powder keg, the silence deafening after Caleb Grant stood up from his wheelchair. Moments ago, Judge Theodore Langston had declared him guilty, sealing a verdict steeped in bias. The jury, except for Marcus Reed, had nodded along, their whispers thick with prejudice. Marcus's lone stand against the injustice had earned him scorn, but Caleb's sudden rise shattered everything. The room held its breath, every eye locked on the man who wasn't supposed to stand, Caleb's gaze fixed on Langston, steady and unyielding. The judge, gripping his bench, looked like he'd seen a ghost, his earlier smirk gone. Michael Vaughn, the prosecutor, blinked rapidly, his polished facade cracking. Jurors sat frozen. A woman with a tight ponytail gasped, her hand clutching her notepad. "Impossible," a man in a plaid jacket muttered, his voice shaky. Marcus Reed stared, his fists still clenched from his outburst. The trial had flipped, and the truth was about to hit like a freight train. In one fluid motion, Caleb reached into his pocket, pulling out a small metallic object. Langston's hand twitched toward his gavel, as if he could still control this. He couldn't. Caleb flipped open a badge, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. "Caleb Grant, Special Agent, United States Department of Justice." The words landed like a thunderclap. A pen clattered to the floor. A juror in a faded tie choked out a sound, his face pale. Vaughn took a step back, his hands trembling. Langston's jaw clenched, his knuckles white against the bench. Caleb turned to Marcus, his eyes softening. "Thank you, Reed," he said, his voice clear. "You're the only one here with a shred of decency." Marcus froze, the weight of the moment sinking in. Caleb's gaze shifted back to Langston, now sharp as a blade. "I've been investigating you for months, Langston," he said. "How many innocent people have you buried because of their skin? How many verdicts have you sold to the highest bidder?" The accusations hung heavy, each word a nail in Langston's coffin. The room erupted in gasps. A woman in a blue blazer whispered, "He's lying," but her voice lacked conviction. The man with a crew cut sat rigid, his earlier smugness replaced by dread. Langston's face drained of color, but he tried to rally. "This is absurd," he spat, his voice cracking. "You're a fraud, Grant, and I won't let you—" Caleb cut him off, his tone icy. "You targeted me because of who I am, Langston. You thought I was an easy mark, just another black man you could railroad." "You were wrong." Vaughn, now visibly shaken, adjusted his tie, his eyes darting to the exit. "Your Honor, this is a stunt," he stammered, but his usual swagger was gone. A juror in a gray sweater muttered, "He's making it up," but the words sounded hollow. The jury's bias, once their shield, now felt like a trap. Marcus watched, his breath shallow. Caleb wasn't just clearing his name, he was exposing a system rotten with corruption and prejudice. Caleb stepped forward, his presence commanding. "You've run this courtroom like your personal kingdom, Langston," he said. "You and your prosecutor friend here, feeding off lies and bigotry. How many others have you crushed to keep your power?" Langston's hands shook, his authority crumbling. "You can't prove anything," he snarled, but his voice betrayed panic. The jurors exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier certainty unraveling. A woman with a tight bun whispered, "What if he's right?" Her neighbor shot her a glare, but doubt had crept in. The tension was a live wire sparking through the room. Caleb's badge gleamed in his hand, a symbol of the justice Langston had mocked. Marcus sat still, his earlier defiance now vindicated. The man he'd stood up for wasn't a fraud. He was the one holding the truth. Langston's eyes darted to Vaughn, then to the jurors, searching for an ally. He found none. The room, once his domain, was slipping from his grasp. Then, a deafening crash. The courtroom doors. Bam! The doors slammed open, splintering against the walls. A dozen federal agents stormed in, their movements swift and precise. The room exploded into chaos. Spectators gasped, jurors twisted in their seats, and a woman in the gallery let out a cry. The air was electric, a storm breaking at last. Caleb stood tall, his badge still raised, as the agents closed in, their target clear. The courtroom was chaos, the thunderous crash of the doors still echoing as federal agents stormed in. Caleb Grant, revealed as a Department of Justice special agent, stood tall, his badge gleaming like a beacon of truth. Judge Theodore Langston, moments ago the untouchable ruler of this room, gripped his bench, his face pale. Michael Vaughn, the once smug prosecutor, backed away, his hands shaking. The jury, save for Marcus Reed, sat stunned, their earlier bias now a weight they couldn't shake. The trial had collapsed, and justice was finally taking the stand. Agents moved with precision, their boots echoing on the polished floor. Langston bolted upright, his voice raw with panic. "No," he shouted, his head snapping from Caleb to the agents. "This is my courtroom. I am the law." His words, once a weapon, now sounded hollow, desperate. Two agents grabbed him, yanking his arms behind his back. The click of handcuffs was sharp, final. Langston thrashed, his face twisted in fury. "You can't do this. I'm a judge." But the gavel was gone, his power stripped. A woman in the gallery let out a strangled cry, and spectators gasped, their whispers a mix of shock and disbelief. Vaughn stumbled back, his tie askew, his eyes darting for an escape. "This is a mistake," he stammered, but no one listened. The man who'd painted Caleb as a stereotype, a guy from that part of town, now faced the wreckage of his lies. A juror in a plaid jacket muttered, "How did this happen?" His earlier sneer, "They always do," was a distant memory, replaced by shame. The woman with a tight ponytail stared at the floor, her notepad forgotten. "We got it wrong," she whispered, barely audible. The jury's bias, once their shield, had blinded them to the truth. Caleb stood steady, his gaze sweeping the room. "This isn't just about me," he said, his voice clear. "It's about every person Langston condemned because of who they were, every verdict he twisted for power." His words hit hard, exposing the rot in the system. Marcus Reed sat still, the weight of his earlier stand, defying Langston's threats, now lifting. He'd been mocked, called naive for defending Caleb, but he'd been right. The other jurors avoided his eyes, their faces a mix of guilt and realization. A man with a crew cut shifted uncomfortably, his earlier grunt of "case closed" now a bitter echo. Langston's shouts faded as agents dragged him toward the doors. "You'll pay for this," he screamed, but the room no longer feared him. His house of cards, built on corruption and prejudice, had fallen. Vaughn slumped in his chair, his hands covering his face, knowing his role in the scheme was exposed. The gallery buzzed, spectators whispering about the judge who'd ruled with an iron fist, now powerless. A woman in a blue blazer, who'd once said throw the book at him, sat silent, her smugness gone. The courtroom settled, the chaos giving way to a strange calm. Marcus glanced at the jury, their shoulders slumping as the spell of Langston's authority broke. For too long they'd been complicit, swayed by whispers of his kind, and they never learn. Now they faced the truth. They'd nearly condemned an innocent man. A faint whisper broke the silence, from a juror in a gray sweater. "It's over." The words carried relief, a release from the injustice they'd all endured. Outside the courthouse, the air was crisp, untainted. Caleb had won, exposing a system warped by greed and bias, but the victory was bittersweet. How many others had faced judges like Langston, prosecutors like Vaughn, juries quick to judge based on skin? The thought lingered, heavy and urgent. For years the law had seemed a beacon of truth, but this trial revealed its fragility. A system at war with corruption, needing people to fight for it. This trial in New Haven showed justice isn't automatic, it's a fight. Caleb Grant exposed a corrupt system, and Marcus Reed spoke out despite the risk. We all face moments where standing against unfairness feels hard, but that's where change begins. Speak up, share this story, and keep the fight for fairness alive. Comment below, have you ever challenged injustice? Like, subscribe, and join us for more interesting stories.